On March 30th, 2002, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, died peacefully at Royal Lodge, Windsor. She was 101 years old. Britain mourned. Flags dropped to half-staff. 250,000 people filed past her coffin at Westminster Hall. The newspapers called her the nation's grandmother, a symbol of wartime resilience, a treasure. But at Clarence House, the London residence where she'd lived for nearly 50 years, approximately 40 staff members knew a different woman. And if you look at what those staff witnessed, really look at it, you'll start to see a pattern. One that didn't die with her. One that's playing out right now in real time with familiar players and predictable outcomes. Here's what they don't want you to notice. Esther Addley, writing in The Guardian on April 1, 2002, asked a pointed question. What happens to the staff who spent decades pandering to her every whim? That phrase, pandering to her every whim, tells you something the official obituaries left out. The public Queen Mother was warmth personified. She remembered names, asked after families, seemed genuinely delighted to meet ordinary people at garden parties and hospital openings. This wasn't entirely an act. By most accounts, she genuinely enjoyed the performance of public life. But performance is the key word. Behind closed doors at Clarence House, a different woman emerged. Tanya Gold, also writing in The Guardian, put it bluntly in September 2009. When we remember the Queen Mother, let us not overlook her cruelty. Strong word. Cruelty. Gold was referencing something specific, the fate of Katherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother's own nieces. Both women had severe learning disabilities. In 1941, they were committed to the Royal Earlswood Hospital, a mental institution in Surrey. That same year, Burke's Peerage, the official record of British nobility, listed both women as having died in 1940. They hadn't died. Nerissa lived until 1986. Katherine survived until 2014. For decades, the family's official genealogy recorded living relatives as dead because their existence was inconvenient. Now, you might say the Queen Mother wasn't directly responsible for that decision. Fair enough. But she knew. The family knew. And no one corrected the record. No one visited. When Nerissa died at the institution in 1986, there was no royal presence at her grave. The headstone wasn't even marked until journalists discovered the deception years later. This was the woman Britain called its grandmother. But the Queen Mother's capacity for sustained, deliberate cruelty found its purest expression in her treatment of one woman, Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee who had the audacity to be loved by the king. Let's be precise about what happened, because the details matter. Wallis Warfield was born on June 19, 1896, in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania. She married Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., a Navy aviator, in 1916. That marriage lasted until 1927. She then married Ernest Aldrich Simpson, an Anglo-American businessman, in 1928. By the mid-1930s, she'd caught the attention of Edward, Prince of Wales, the man who would briefly become King Edward VIII. Edward was already a concern to palace insiders. Tommy Lascelles, his own private secretary, wrote to his wife on September 8, 1927, that he'd concluded the prince was unfit for kingship. Lascelles described observing Edward's mental and moral deterioration over years of close service. This was 5 years before the Wallis situation exploded. But Edward didn't care what his staff thought. He didn't care what the government thought. He loved Wallis Simpson, and he intended to marry her. On January 20, 1936, King George V died at Sandringham House. Edward became King Edward VIII. On October 27, 1936, just 51 days into his reign, Wallis filed for divorce from Ernest Simpson at Ipswich Assizes. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had already met with Edward on October 20, 1936, making the government's position explicit. Marriage to a twice-divorced woman, whose former husbands were both still living, would be unacceptable. The Church of England wouldn't sanction it. The Dominion governments, Australia, Canada, South Africa, the Irish Free State, all indicated they would not accept Wallis Simpson as queen. Edward proposed a compromise on November 25, 1936, a morganatic marriage. Wallis would be his wife, but not his queen. Any children wouldn't inherit the throne. Baldwin presented the proposal to the cabinet on November 27th. The cabinet formally rejected it on December 2nd. On December 10, 1936, at Fort Belvedere, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. His 3 younger brothers witnessed it: Albert, Henry, and George. The following day, Parliament passed the legislation, and Edward made his famous radio address, the one where he told the nation he couldn't carry the burden of the crown without the help and support of the woman I love. Albert, Duke of York, became King George VI on December 11, 1936. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon became Queen Consort, and this is where the pattern begins. Elizabeth had never wanted to be queen. She'd turned down Albert's marriage proposals at least twice before finally accepting in January 1923. The engagement announcement came on January 16, 1923. She'd agreed to marry the king's second son, specifically because it meant a comfortable life without the crushing weight of the crown. The heir was Edward. Edward would marry. Edward would have children. The York family would remain supporting players. Wallis Simpson destroyed that understanding. Now Elizabeth was queen consort to a man who'd never expected to be king. Her shy, stammering husband was suddenly responsible for an empire. Her daughters were thrust into the succession, and she never, ever forgave Wallis for it. Here's what forgiveness didn't look like. On May 27, 1937, 7 days before Edward and Wallis were to marry, King George VI issued letters patent that would govern Wallis's status for the rest of her life. The document stated that while the Duke of Windsor, as Edward was now styled per letters patent issued March 8, 1937, would retain the dignity of Royal Highness, this title would not extend to his wife and descendants, if any. Read that again. His wife would not be Her Royal Highness, ever. When Edward married Wallis on June 3, 1937, at the Château de Condé in France, not a single member of the British royal family attended. Not his mother, not his brothers. No one. The Church of England refused to sanction the marriage. A vicar named Robert Anderson Jardine defied his bishop to perform the ceremony, an act that effectively ended his career in the church. And then came the exile. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor settled in Paris. A 1939 letter, referenced in The Guardian's 2000 profile of the Queen Mother as the enforcer, documented Elizabeth's explicit refusal to receive Wallis Simpson under any circumstances. This wasn't a temporary position. This wasn't a cooling-off period. This was permanent. The Windsors lived the rest of their lives in a house at 4 Route du Champ d'Entremont in the Bois de Boulogne, provided by the city of Paris. Gilded exile. They watched the royal family from across the Channel, never quite allowed back in. Queen Mary, Edward's mother, maintained communication with her eldest son, but refused to meet his wife until her death on March 24, 1953. She wrote to the Duke, explaining she could not change her position regarding the woman for whom he had given up the throne of this great empire. The Duke of Windsor died on May 28, 1972. His funeral took place on June 5, 1972, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The Duchess attended. She stayed at Buckingham Palace during the visit, the first time she'd been received as a guest in a royal residence. The first time, after 35 years of marriage to a former king. As the Duchess was leaving after the funeral, the Queen Mother approached her. According to contemporaneous reports, she said, "I do hope we meet again." The Duchess replied, "When I am buried, I suppose." They never met again. The Duchess died on April 24, 1986. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel on April 29, 1986. The Queen Mother attended. The headstone at Frogmore reads simply, Wallis, Duchess of Windsor, 1896 to 1986. No Royal Highness, not even in death. So, what were Wallis Simpson's crimes? Let's list them. She was American. She was divorced. Twice. She was perceived as having pursued the king rather than being pursued by him, an ambitious woman rather than a passive prize. And there was the Germany trip. In October 1937, the Duke and Duchess visited Nazi Germany as guests of Adolf Hitler. They met with the Führer at Berchtesgaden on October 22, 1937. Photographs circulated of the Duke appearing to give a Nazi salute. This provided ammunition for those who viewed Wallis as unsuitable. These were the charges: American, divorced, ambitious, Nazi adjacent. For these crimes, Wallis Simpson was denied the title Her Royal Highness. She was excluded from every royal family event for decades. She was frozen out by a sustained, coordinated campaign led by a woman who smiled warmly at strangers in public and wrote poisonous letters in private. That was the playbook in 1937. Now let's look at 2005. Camilla Rosemary Shand was born on July 17, 1947. She met Prince Charles at a polo match in Windsor Great Park in 1970. A mutual friend, Lucia Santa Cruz, introduced them. Their connection was immediate, and immediately understood as problematic. Camilla wasn't a virgin. In an era when that still mattered for royal brides, her romantic history made her unsuitable marriage material for the heir apparent. In March 1973, while Charles was serving aboard HMS Minerva in the Caribbean, Camilla's engagement to Andrew Parker Bowles was announced. They married on July 4, 1973. But the relationship with Charles didn't end. It resumed at some point during his marriage to Diana Spencer. Diana herself described it on Panorama, broadcast November 20th, 1995. There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. On December 9th, 1989, a mobile phone conversation between Charles and Camilla was intercepted and recorded. When the transcript was published in January 1993, first in the Australian magazine New Idea, then in British tabloids, it became one of the most humiliating royal scandals in modern history. Charles told his married lover he wished he could be a tampon, so he could live inside your trousers. This was adultery, on both sides, recorded, published, global. Charles and Diana separated on December 9, 1992. Their divorce became final on August 28, 1996. Diana lost the style, Her Royal Highness, the same designation that had been denied to Wallis Simpson. Diana died in a car crash in Paris on August 31, 1997. She was 36. And then, slowly, carefully, the rehabilitation of Camilla began. Consider what Camilla's crimes were. She was divorced, like Wallis. She had engaged in a long-term adulterous affair with the heir to the throne, worse than anything Wallis did. She had helped destroy the most popular royal marriage in living memory, a public relations catastrophe of historic proportions. And yet, On April 9, 2005, Charles and Camilla married at Windsor Guildhall. The Queen did not attend the civil ceremony, but she attended the blessing afterward at St. George's Chapel. On September 8, 2022, Camilla became Queen Consort. On May 6, 2023, at Westminster Abbey, Camilla was crowned alongside Charles III. She is now Queen Camilla, Her Royal Highness. So let's be clear about what happened here. Wallis Simpson, American, divorced, no evidence of adultery with Edward before his abdication, punishment, denied HRH for life, excluded from the family for decades, buried without royal style. Camilla Parker Bowles, British, divorced, documented adultery while Charles was married to Diana.
Outcome: Queen Consort, then Queen, crowned at Westminster Abbey.
The same institution, the same family, different standards. Why? There's only one variable that explains the difference. Wallis Simpson caused a constitutional crisis. She forced an abdication. The monarchy survived, but it was close, and the woman who became Queen Consort in 1936 never forgot what that crisis cost her. Camilla, by contrast, didn't threaten the succession. She waited. Charles waited. Diana died. The public eventually moved on, and by the time Camilla married into the family, there was no crisis to resolve. Just a quiet ceremony and a slow campaign to make the British public forget what they'd all witnessed. The playbook isn't about morality. It's about institutional survival. If you threaten the succession, you're exiled. If you don't, you're rehabilitated. Which brings us to Meghan Markle. Meghan Rachel Markle was born on August 4, 1981 in Los Angeles. She married producer Trevor Engelson in 2011. They divorced in 2013. She met Prince Harry in 2016, and their engagement was announced on November 27, 2017. They married at St. George's Chapel on May 19, 2018. American. Divorced. Outsider. The comparisons to Wallis Simpson started almost immediately. Commenters noted the parallels. The press ran the stories. And then, in January 2020, Harry and Meghan announced they were stepping back from senior royal duties. By March 2020, they'd completed their final engagements. They now live in Montecito, California. Exile. Self-imposed, but exile nonetheless. Their son Archie was born on May 6, 2019. Their daughter Lilibet was born on June 4, 2021. The question of whether these children would receive royal titles and the HRH style became a point of public contention after the death of Elizabeth II in September 2022. Notice the pattern. Wallis Simpson, American, divorced, denied HRH.
Meghan Markle, American, divorced, now in California, while questions swirl about her children's titles. Harry himself has been compared to Edward VIII, a prince accused of being led away from duty by an ambitious American woman. Some commenters have used the word weak to describe both men. But here's what the parallel misses. Edward abdicated to marry Wallis. Harry didn't abdicate anything. He stepped back from a role, not a throne. The comparison flatters the institution more than the facts support. What the comparison does capture is the playbook. Briefings against family members leaked to favored reporters. Questions about titles and designations. Geographic separation, whether imposed, Bahamas, Paris, or chosen, Montecito. The subtle and not so subtle signals that certain women are acceptable and certain women aren't. The Queen Mother died in 2002, but her template survives. The institution decides who belongs and who doesn't, who gets rehabilitated and who stays frozen out. Who becomes Queen Camilla And who becomes the Duchess of Windsor, buried without the style she was denied for 50 years? The question isn't whether the monarchy has a playbook for outsider women. It obviously does. The question is who gets which treatment and why. Camilla waited. She played the long game. She didn't challenge the institution directly, and she was rewarded. Meghan didn't wait. She spoke publicly. She and Harry gave that Oprah interview in March 2021. If the pattern holds, and it's held for 80 years, we know what comes next. Continued exclusion. Continued questions about the children's status. Continued briefings to preferred journalists about what sources close to the palace think about the situation. The same playbook, different decade. When the Queen Mother died, Britain mourned a symbol, the grandmother of the nation, the last Empress of India. But symbols aren't people. People have nieces they pretend are dead. People write letters refusing to receive their brother-in-law's wife for 35 years. People say, "I do hope we meet again," to a widow at her husband's funeral, knowing they never will. The next time you read a story about the royal family and an outsider woman, ask yourself, which template is being applied? Camilla's or Wallis's? The answer usually tells you everything you need to know. Subscribe for more stories like this.